Somewhere in the world right now, an Iranian intelligence officer sitting in a cafe he has never visited before, meeting someone he will never meet again, passing instructions that will travel through 4 more hands before they reach the person who actually carries them out. No names, no phones, no record, and the attack that follows will look like a local crime. It is November 2024. Melbourne, Australia. 3:47 in the morning, a man walks toward the Adass Israel synagogue. He is not running. He is not hiding his face in a way that suggests panic. He moves the way someone moves when they have rehearsed this, when they know exactly how long it takes and exactly which direction to walk afterward. Within minutes, the building is on fire. 12 hours later, in Sydney, a kosher restaurant takes fire damage. Same method, different city, same night. Australian federal police open a terrorism investigation. Within the first 48 hours, they are already building a profile. Domestic actor, local grievance, probably connected to someone in the city's far-right or Islamist fringe. The investigators are experienced. They are thorough. They are looking at the wrong picture. The man who lit that fire had never been to Iran. He did not speak Farsi. He had no ideological attachment to the Islamic Republic, no history of political violence, no connection to any known terror network in any database that Australian authorities maintained. He had a debt, and someone had offered to clear it. The instruction had come through a chain so layered that even if every person in it had cooperated fully with law enforcement from the moment of arrest, the thread would have gone cold before it reached the man who designed the operation. That man was not in Melbourne. He was not in Australia. He was inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, operating out of Tehran, running a mechanism that had been under construction for nearly 3 years, and that by the time that synagogue burned was active across more than 30 countries simultaneously. His name was Sardar Amar, and a Mossad analyst named Dov had been building a file on him for 18 months. Dov is not a field operative. He does not carry weapons. He does not travel under a false name to conduct meetings in parking garages. His work happens in a secure office in Tel Aviv, on screens, across databases, tracking a specific category of problem that is harder to map than any missile program. The problem is architecture. After October 7, 2023, the Mossad understood that Iran had made a strategic decision. Its conventional proxy forces, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, were being ground down by the weight of the war Iran had helped ignite. The deterrent structure Tehran had spent decades building was degrading faster than its leadership had calculated. They needed a different instrument, one that could keep pressure on Israel, keep its people afraid, keep its diplomats and communities worldwide in a permanent state of vulnerability, without giving Israel, or the United States, a justification to strike Iranian soil. The answer was to make the attacks look like they had nothing to do with Iran. Not occasionally, systematically. Dov's file on Sardar Amar began as a name attached to intercepted communications that did not quite fit the profile of Quds Force activity. The Quds Force, the IRGC's foreign military arm, had a recognizable signature. It built proxy armies. It moved weapons. It funded and trained standing organizations that operated in the open, in theaters where Iran maintained territorial influence. What Dov was seeing was different. The communications referenced no proxy forces, no weapons shipments, no standing organizations. They referenced criminals. They referenced recruiters operating in migrant communities in Western European cities. They referenced payment structures running through cryptocurrency wallets and informal Hawala networks. This was not the Quds Force's architecture. This was something else. It took Dov 8 months of cross-referencing to identify what he was looking at. Unit 4000, the IRGC Intelligence Organization's Special Operations Department. Formerly distinct from the Quds Force, reporting through a separate chain of command, designed specifically for one purpose: kinetic operations on foreign soil with no Iranian fingerprints. The doctrine was not improvised. It had been refined over years and expanded massively after October 7th. You do not send Iranians into the field. You find locals. You find people with debts, people with grievances, people who can be paid or pressured. You route instructions through so many intermediaries that the chain is functionally untraceable. You target Israeli embassies, Jewish community institutions, critical infrastructure, senior officials, and you make each attack look like a domestic incident in whatever country it occurs. The genius of it, and the reason it had been working, was that it exploited something that no intelligence service can fully overcome: the reluctance of democratic governments to make public accusations against a sovereign state without evidence that can survive public scrutiny. Iran knew this. It had been relying on it. By mid-2024, Dove's team had a partial map of the network. Partial, because Unit 4000 had been built to resist exactly this kind of mapping. The cells did not know each other. The intermediaries did not know who was above them in the chain. The operatives at the bottom knew nothing except a task, a target, and a payment method. But the man connecting all of it, the circulatory system of the operation, was not a cell member. He was a coordinator. His name was Mohsen Suri. Suri traveled, constantly, carefully, using different documents across different legs of the same journey, always entering countries for what appeared to be legitimate business purposes, always departing before local counterintelligence could establish a pattern. He never stayed more than 72 hours in any single location. He met with local cell managers face to face because certain information in the doctrine Unit 4000 operated under was never committed to any channel that could be intercepted. Dov had Suri's face. He had fragments of his travel pattern. He did not yet have his full network. And then, in late 2024, something changed. The volume of attack attempts spiked in a way that suggested Unit 4000 was no longer in a construction phase. It was in an operational phase, more than 50 foiled attempts in a single year. Greece, Germany, Australia, Cyprus, Turkey, the United Kingdom, Azerbaijan, the United Arab Emirates. Each one investigated locally, each one appearing unconnected to the others. Dov's team was watching a single organism express itself in 30 different countries simultaneously, and the world was seeing 30 separate incidents. The question that Dov's team could not yet answer, and that kept the operation from moving into its next phase, was a structural one. They had Ammar at the top, they had Suri in the middle, they had cells at the bottom. What they did not have was the layer between Suri and the cells, the handlers, the people who translated Suri's coordination visits into specific operational instructions delivered to specific criminals in specific cities. Without that layer documented, the chain had a gap that Iran's lawyers, Iran's diplomats, Iran's state media could drive through the moment any of this was made public. And making it public, not just stopping the attacks, but making the architecture visible in a way that forced diplomatic consequences, was the whole point. Because the Mossad had concluded something that changed the shape of the entire operation. Stopping individual attacks was not enough. 50 foiled plots meant 50 saved lives, but it did not mean the network stopped. It meant the network recalibrated and tried again. The only way to actually impose a cost on Iran was to destroy something it valued more than any individual cell: its deniability. To do that, you need more than intelligence. You need evidence. You need named people, documented methods, a case that survives public presentation in Canberra, in Berlin, in Athens, in front of governments that have their own reasons to avoid confrontation with Tehran, and that will look for any ambiguity to justify inaction. Building that case meant something that no one in the room was comfortable saying directly. It meant letting parts of the network operate long enough to be fully documented. And in at least one country, the materials for the next operation were already inside the border. In Azerbaijan, in the winter of 2025, a Unit 4000 cell had finished its preparation phase. The targets had been selected, the routes had been confirmed. The materials, explosive drones, smuggled from Iran through a chain of intermediaries, had already cleared the border. Dove's team knew the cell existed. They knew the general category of targets. They did not yet know whether the command to execute had already been issued. The question was not whether Azerbaijan's security services could stop it. The question was what stopping it now would cost them later. There is a principle inside intelligence work that does not appear in any doctrine manual, but that every senior analyst understands intuitively. The moment you decide to watch instead of act, you have made a choice about whose safety you are willing to risk. You never say it that cleanly. You frame it in operational language, extended observation window, pattern confirmation phase, source protection requirements. The language softens the arithmetic, but the arithmetic remains. Dov knew this, his station chief knew this, and in the late autumn of 2025, in a series of meetings that were not minuted in any format that would be reviewed by oversight committees, the question was being asked directly for the first time. How long do you let it run? The Azerbaijan cell had been under joint Israeli-Azerbaijani surveillance for 11 weeks. In that time, the picture had sharpened considerably. The cell had 4 primary members. 2 Iranian nationals, Behnam Sahibali Rostamzadeh and Yasser Rahim Zandikian, were the operational core. An Azerbaijani citizen named Tarkan Tarlanoglu Guliev was the local facilitator. And above them, coordinating from a distance through encrypted channels, was an IRGC intelligence officer, identified as Ali Asghar Bardbar Sharamini, a planner, not a field operative, whose name had not appeared in any previous file. That last name was important, not because of who Sharamini was, but because of what his presence confirmed. This was not a cell that had been loosely inspired by Iranian ideology and was freelancing in Azerbaijan. This was a cell receiving active direction from a named IRGC officer inside Iran. The command chain was documentable. The connection between the operation and the Islamic Republic was, for the first time, not inferential. Dov flagged this immediately. His assessment was straightforward. They now had enough to connect the Azerbaijan operation to Unit 4000 with sufficient clarity to withstand public scrutiny. His recommendation was to move, arrest the cell now, surface the evidence, and use the Azerbaijan case as the public anchor for a broader exposure of the network's architecture. His station chief disagreed. The disagreement was not about the quality of the evidence. It was about what the evidence was actually worth at that particular moment. The station chief's position was this: the Azerbaijan cell was a branch. Surfacing it now would tell Unit 4000's leadership 2 things. First, that their operational security in Azerbaijan had been compromised, and second, and more dangerously, that the surveillance methodology that had identified Sharamini as a coordinator was capable of working anywhere the network operated. Unit 4000 would not dissolve. It would adapt. It would change its communication protocols, rotate its handlers, rebuild its intermediary layers with new personnel who had no presence in any existing file. Everything Dov's team had built over 18 months, the partial map, the travel pattern on Suri, the financial threads running through 7 countries, would become outdated within weeks of any public disclosure. The station chief wanted more time. Specifically, he wanted Suri, not Suri arrested. Suri documented, fully, traceable across his entire network of coordination visits, connected by evidence to every cell he had touched in the preceding 2 years. That documentation did not yet exist. They had his face. They had fragments. They did not have the full picture. Dov's counter was blunt. Every additional week of extended observation was a week in which the Azerbaijan cell's materials, the explosive drones, already inside the country, already positioned, remained active. A surveillance operation is not a guarantee. Surveillance fails. Sources get nervous. A cell member makes an unscheduled move. Something breaks in a direction you did not anticipate. If the cell executed even one of its targets before the arrest, the embassy, the synagogue, the pipeline, any of them, the entire framing of the operation changed. You were no longer surfacing evidence of a thwarted plot. You were explaining why you had watched a terror attack happen. There was a silence in the room after Dov said that. Nobody disputed it. What happened next was not a clean resolution. It was a negotiated compromise of the kind that intelligence operations are full of, and that histories rarely capture accurately, because the people involved have every reason to remember it as more deliberate than it actually was. The decision was to maintain surveillance on the Azerbaijan cell for a maximum of 3 additional weeks, with a hard trigger. Any indication that the cell had received an execution order, any movement toward targets, any activation signal in the communication channels being monitored would prompt immediate interdiction regardless of where the Suri documentation stood. 3 weeks. Then they moved regardless. It was the kind of decision that looks reasonable in a meeting room and feels entirely different at 2 a.m. when you are checking whether the cell members have moved from their last known positions. Dov accepted it. He did not entirely agree with it. That distinction would matter later. The 3 weeks passed without an execution order. The cell continued its preparation phase, rehearsing routes, conducting surveillance of targets, communicating with Sharamini through channels that were being read in real time. And in that window, something happened that no one had planned for. A source inside Iran, not Dov's source, not directly connected to the Unit 4000 mapping operation, but someone being run by a different desk, reported that Mohsen Suri had recently visited a location in Tehran that was being used as an IRGC safe house for Unit 4000 coordination meetings. The location was new. It had not appeared in any previous file, and the source's access to it was recent enough that the Mossad could not yet assess how reliable the information was, or whether the source had been fed that detail deliberately. This was the problem that the station chief had not fully accounted for. The more threads you pull simultaneously, the harder it becomes to know which ones are real and which ones are being dangled. Dov's team ran a 3-day assessment of the safe house report. The conclusion was uncomfortable. The location was probably genuine. The sourcing had enough corroborating indicators, cross-referenced against Suri's inferred travel pattern, against communication metadata, against a separate piece of imagery that had been sitting unanalyzed in a backlog file for 6 weeks, to treat it as actionable. Probably genuine. Probably actionable. In a legal proceeding, probably is not enough. In a military targeting context, probably carries a different weight. And here is where the operation began to fracture along a line that had always been present but had not yet been tested. The Mossad's mandate is intelligence and special operations. It does not have unilateral authority to direct military strikes on Iranian soil. That authority runs through a different chain, through the IDF, through the political leadership, through a set of legal and strategic considerations that extend well beyond any single operation. The safe house report was passed up the chain. What came back was not what Dov expected. The response from above was not a targeting authorization. It was a question. Is the network mappable to a level that justifies a public exposure? Not just in Azerbaijan, not just Amr and Suri, the full architecture, the doctrine, the named units, the operational methods, the specific cases in specific countries, in a form that could be released publicly, that would force allied governments to act, and that would strip Iran of the diplomatic cover it had been operating under for 3 years. Because if that case could be built, it changed the entire strategic logic of what they were doing. You were no longer running a counterterrorism operation aimed at disrupting individual cells. You were running an information operation aimed at collapsing the political conditions under which the network could exist. Those are different operations. They have different timelines, different risk tolerances, and different definitions of success. Dov understood immediately what was being asked, and he understood immediately why it complicated everything he had been working toward. Building the public case required surfacing sources and methods to a degree that made him deeply uncomfortable. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make the attribution stick in Berlin, in Canberra, in Athens. Enough that when an Iranian ambassador denied state involvement, the denial would be immediately and visibly implausible. That level of disclosure would close the access that had built the picture in the first place. you would be trading the ongoing intelligence operation for a one-time diplomatic blow. Whether that trade was worth making depended on something Dov could not calculate from his desk. Whether the diplomatic blow would actually change anything, or whether Western governments would absorb the evidence, issue a statement, and quietly return to the posture of managed ambiguity that had served them so comfortably for so long. And then, in early 2026, something happened that removed the choice from the table entirely. The United States and Israel began moving toward direct military action against Iran. Not a covert operation, a declared campaign, targets already selected, timelines already set. A military operation of a scale that would make the question of whether to surface the Unit 4000 file operationally irrelevant, because the men whose names were in that file were about to become targets in a different sense entirely. The window for a carefully managed intelligence disclosure was closing, and Dov's team was being asked to do something it had never been asked to do before. Not just build the case. Build it fast enough to be released simultaneously with military strikes that would eliminate the very people the case was built around, so that by the time Iran formulated a denial, its most credible denialists were already dead. The operation had just changed shape entirely, and somewhere in the files Dov had been building for 18 months, there was a thread he had not yet fully pulled, one that his station chief had flagged once and then not mentioned again. A source whose access was too clean, whose reporting had been too consistently useful, whose position inside the network should not, by any reasonable assessment of Unit 4000's compartmentation doctrine, have given them visibility into the things they were reporting. Dov had noted it. He had not acted on it. He was no longer sure that had been the right call. The authorization came on a Tuesday. Not the full authorization, not the public disclosure, not the targeting package, not the coordinated diplomatic notifications to allied governments. Just the first step. Move on the Azerbaijan cell. Collect the arrests, secure the materials. The broader operation, the public exposure of Unit 4000, the simultaneous release of the documented case across 30 countries, the diplomatic notifications to Australia, Germany, Greece would follow. But it would only follow if the Azerbaijan arrests produced what they were expected to produce. Clean evidence, documented chain of command, materials that could be photographed and attributed without ambiguity. The assumption built into the authorization was that the Azerbaijan arrests were the straightforward part. That assumption was wrong within the first 6 hours. Azerbaijani state security moved on the cell at 4 a.m. on a Thursday in early March 2026. The operation was planned for simultaneous entry at 2 locations: the apartment where Rostamzadeh and Zandekian had been based for the preceding 3 weeks, and a secondary location where Guliev, the local facilitator, had been storing materials. The entry at Guliev's location went cleanly. He was there. The materials were there. The explosive drones, smuggled from Iran through Turkey and into Azerbaijan through a route that had taken the surveillance team 4 months to map, were photographed, catalogued, and secured within 40 minutes. The entry at the primary apartment found one person. Zandekian was there. Rostamzadeh was not. In the first hour after the arrests, the working assumption was that Rostamzadeh had been running an errand. An early morning absence. Timing, bad luck. He would surface within the day and the operation could proceed. Dov, monitoring from Tel Aviv, did not share the assumption. Rostamzadeh had not been running an errand. Rostamzadeh had not been in the apartment for at least 36 hours, which meant that the surveillance coverage on the primary location had missed a departure, and that the missed departure had gone unreported through whatever internal process was supposed to flag anomalies. Someone had looked at the surveillance logs and decided the gap was not significant enough to escalate. That decision, made by someone whose name Dov did not know and could not immediately identify, had now created a live problem. Rostamzadeh was mobile, and he had no way of knowing whether his cell had been compromised, but he would know within hours when Zandekian failed to make a scheduled contact. The question was where he went when he found out. The Azerbaijani services ran his last known movements for the 36-hour window. He had left the apartment on a Tuesday evening, which was the same day the authorization had come through in Tel Aviv. That timing sat badly with everyone who was shown it. The coordinated authorization, the movement, the same day, it could be coincidence. Operational decisions generate communications, and communications generate risk. And risk sometimes expresses itself in ways that look like correlation but are not. Dov knew this. He had seen analysts build false patterns from timing coincidences before. But he had also flagged a source whose access was too clean. He pulled that thread now, for the first time with genuine urgency. The source had contributed 3 specific pieces of information over the preceding 4 months. Each piece had been corroborated. Each piece had proven accurate. The safe house location that had been passed up the chain, the one that had ultimately fed into the targeting package, had come from that source. If the source was a feed, if Unit 4000 had identified the penetration and turned it, using it to control what the Mossad thought it knew, then the safe house location might not be an IRGC coordination point. It might be a clean location, or a decoy, or something worse, a location that Iran wanted struck for reasons that had nothing to do with Mohsen Suri. Dov wrote the assessment. He flagged it as time-sensitive. He sent it up. The response came back in 2 hours. Assessment noted, operation proceeds, targeting package under separate review. He did not find that reassuring. Rostamzadeh was located on the 2nd day. He had not left Azerbaijan. He had moved to a 3rd location, a contact address that had not appeared in any previous surveillance file, and he had been there since Tuesday evening. The timing question remained open. It would stay open. These things often do. What mattered operationally was that he was found before he could be extracted across the Iranian border, which had been the primary concern. He was arrested without incident. He did not resist. He appeared, according to the Azerbaijani officers who conducted the arrest, genuinely confused about why it had taken so long. That detail, his apparent confusion, was the first thing that felt clean in 48 hours. With all 4 cell members in custody and the materials secured, the next phase was supposed to begin. The documentation review, the chain of command verification, the preparation of the public case. It did not begin immediately, because Zandekian, in his first interview, said something that stopped the Azerbaijani investigators and was immediately flagged to the Israeli liaison. He said the operation had been postponed, not cancelled, postponed. 2 weeks earlier, through Sharamini's channel, the cell had received a message that the timeline was being extended. No reason given. Standard practice, cells were not given operational reasoning, only instructions. But the postponement meant that the cell had not been in an active execution phase when the arrests occurred. It meant the arrest had been triggered not by an imminent threat, but by the 3-week deadline Dov's team had imposed. On the surface, this changed nothing. The materials were real, the targets were real, the IRGC command chain was documented. But it changed something in the public case, because Iran's response to any exposure would center on exactly this point. The cell had not been about to act. The evidence was of preparation, not execution. The Iranian state would argue loudly, in every diplomatic form available, that what had been foiled was a surveillance operation, not an imminent attack. That the arrests were political theater timed to coincide with Israeli military operations against Iran. It was a weak argument. But weak arguments delivered confidently through state media and sympathetic diplomatic channels had kept Iranian deniability intact for years. Dov's team spent 4 days rebuilding the public case around this complication. The answer was not to hide the postponement. That would surface eventually and would damage everything. The answer was to document it as a feature of Unit 4000's operational doctrine. Cells were regularly placed in standby phases. Timelines adjusted from Tehran based on factors the cell members were never told. The postponement was not evidence of innocence. It was evidence of Central Command coordination. That reframing held. It was incorporated into the public case. But it had cost 4 days, and those 4 days sat inside a larger timeline that was not waiting. The U.S.-Israeli military operation was moving. Targets inside Iran were being finalized. The window in which the public exposure of Unit 4000 would land simultaneously with the elimination of Unit 4000's leadership, creating the specific effect of a denial that could not be sustained because the denialists were no longer alive to deliver it, was narrow and narrowing. On the night before the coordinated public release, Dov received one more piece of information about the source whose access had concerned him. The source had gone silent. Not in a way that was clearly alarming. Sources go silent for legitimate reasons, for personal reasons, for reasons that have nothing to do with the operation. But silent at this specific moment, after months of consistent reporting, after the authorization came through, after Rostamzadeh moved to an unmonitored address on the same day the authorization was issued. There was nothing actionable in the silence. There was no basis to halt the operation on the grounds of a source who had simply stopped reporting. Dov wrote a second note. He flagged it at the same priority level as the first. He did not know whether anyone read it before the strikes began. He would spend a long time not knowing. The public release was prepared. The Allied governments were notified, Canberra, Berlin, Athens, with enough lead time to formulate their responses, but not so much that the information could be leaked before the strikes created the conditions in which denial was impossible. The operation was ready. The men whose names were in Dov's file were still alive. For approximately the next 18 hours, the two halves of the operation, the intelligence case and the military campaign, would run on parallel tracks, and the question of whether they would land simultaneously, whether the timing would hold, whether the source's silence meant what Dov feared it might mean, remained entirely open. The thing about an operation built on the destruction of someone else's deniability is that it requires your own to remain intact until the very last moment. Dov was no. The strikes began on the 3rd of March, not the public release. The strikes. The sequencing had been designed so that the military action and the intelligence disclosure would land within hours of each other, close enough that Iran's denial apparatus would have no room to operate, no window in which to construct a narrative before the named commanders were already dead and the documented evidence was already in the hands of Allied governments. What actually happened was a gap. The strikes ran on military time. The public disclosure ran on diplomatic time. And diplomatic time, even when compressed, involves foreign ministries and legal review, and heads of government who want to read the full brief before their ambassadors ask to deliver a formal notification. The gap was approximately 14 hours. In those 14 hours, Iranian state media ran its first response. The framing was exactly what Dov's team had anticipated and had built the public case to preempt. The arrests in Azerbaijan were politically motivated. The IRGC officers named in Israeli intelligence releases were either fictional, misidentified, or low-level figures whose actions did not represent state policy. The strikes on Iranian soil were unprovoked aggression. 14 hours is not long, but it is long enough for a narrative to find its first audience. And in the specific diplomatic environment of early 2026, with U.S.-Iran negotiations still formally open, with several European governments deeply uncomfortable about the scale of the military campaign, that first audience was not insignificant. Rahman Mokaddam was confirmed dead on March 3rd, killed in a strike on a residential tower in Tehran's Kosar complex. Majid Kadami was killed the same week. Mohsen Suri, the coordinator, the man Dov had spent 18 months tracking through fragments of travel records and communication metadata, was killed at the safe house that had been identified through the source whose silence had alarmed Dov on the night before the operation went live. The safe house was real. The strike was precise. Suri died along with several other IRGC members at the location. Dov's concern about the source had not been wrong in its instinct, but the instinct had not resolved into confirmation before the strikes, and the strikes had proceeded, and the safe house had been genuine. The source's silence remained unexplained. It is still unexplained. In intelligence work, Unexplained is not the same as resolved. Dov knows the difference. The joint statement from the Mossad, Shin Bet, and IDF was released on April 20th, 2026. It was unusual in form. 3 agencies simultaneously, with named individuals, documented methods, and case-specific attribution across multiple countries. The diplomatic notifications had gone to Canberra, Berlin, and Athens. The responses followed within days. Australia expelled Iranian ambassador Ahmad Sadeghi and announced plans to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Germany summoned Tehran's envoy. Greece issued a formal statement connecting the 2024 Athens arrests to Iranian state direction. These were described in Israeli government communications and in most Western media coverage as unprecedented diplomatic consequences. They were unprecedented. They were also the minimum. No sanctions, no multilateral coordination mechanism, no formal designation process at the United Nations, where the structural reality of the Security Council made such action impossible regardless of the evidence. The countries that expelled or summoned diplomats did so individually, without coordination, in response to pressure that was case-specific rather than systemic. Iran issued denials. The denials were implausible given the evidence. They were delivered anyway, through every available channel, and they found traction in the specific places they were designed to find traction. In governments that had their own reasons to avoid escalation, in media environments where both sides' framing applied even to documented state terrorism. The gap between what the evidence showed and what the international response produced was not a failure of the Mossad's operation. It was a demonstration of the limits of what intelligence exposure can achieve when the political will to act on it is uneven. Dov had worried about exactly this. He had not been wrong to worry. The network did not stop. Within weeks of the joint statement, British counter-terror police were investigating arson attacks on Jewish sites in London, attacks claimed by a group calling itself Harakat al-Shab al-Yamin al-Islamiyah. The Metropolitan Police were examining whether this was a new IRGC front organization, running the same architecture under a different name, adapting in near real time to the decapitation of the named leadership. The adaptation was faster than anyone had projected. This was the cost of the decision made 18 months earlier, the decision to map the architecture rather than disrupt it early, to let the network operate long enough to be fully documented. The documentation had produced the exposure. The exposure had produced the diplomatic consequences, and the diplomatic consequences, real as they were, had not prevented the network from rebuilding below the level that had been targeted. Unit 4000's commanders were dead. Unit 4000's doctrine was not. The doctrine lived in the criminal intermediaries who had never met an IRGC officer and could not be connected to one. It lived in the payment mechanisms that had already processed their transactions and left no reversible trail. It lived in the operational template, recruit locally, pay through intermediaries, target symbolically, maintain deniability, that required no central coordination to replicate. In late April, 2 Jewish individuals were stabbed in the Golders Green neighborhood of London. A declared terrorist attack. The second on Britain's Jewish community in 7 months. The question of whether that attack was connected to the surviving network, to the Harakat al-Shab al-Yaman group, to Iranian direction filtering through new channels, to the rebuilt architecture that Israeli analysts were already beginning to map again, was open. It remained open. There is a cost that does not appear in operational assessments because it is not the kind of cost that fits into the categories operational assessments use. Dov's team had spent 18 months building a picture of a network that was killing people, or trying to. During those 18 months, they had made decisions about timing that were defensible, that were made with the information available, that were reviewed and authorized at appropriate levels. They had also watched attacks happen that they knew were connected to the network they were mapping: the Melbourne synagogue, the Sydney restaurant, the Athens arson. They had watched and documented and continued building the case because the judgment was that the case, the public, diplomacy-forcing case, was worth more in strategic terms than the disruption of individual attacks that would have alerted the network and collapsed the mapping operation. That judgment may have been correct. The public exposure of Unit 4000 was a genuine strategic achievement. The elimination of its senior leadership was real. The diplomatic costs imposed on Iran were real, if insufficient. The synagogue in Melbourne is still being repaired. These two things are both true simultaneously. Intelligence work does not resolve that tension. It accumulates it. Iran is rebuilding. This is not an assessment. It is a structural certainty, confirmed by the same Israeli National Security Council that issued a travel advisory in the weeks following the exposure, describing Iran as the #1 source of terrorism against Israelis and Jews worldwide, and noting that Iranian motivation was growing, not diminishing, because the strikes on IRGC infrastructure had generated a desire for retribution, now cascading through surviving cells. The new architecture will be more compartmented. The intermediary layers will be thicker. The cell members will know even less about the chain above them. The payment mechanisms will be more dispersed. The command signals will be shorter, less frequent, and harder to intercept. Every lesson that Unit 4000's failure taught, the IRGC's intelligence apparatus has already begun to incorporate. The Mossad is already watching. Not the same network. A new one, being built in the negative space left by the one that was exposed, shaped precisely by the knowledge of how the previous one was found. Dove's team has a new file. It is thin. A name, attached to a communication that does not quite fit the profile of any known unit. A travel pattern with gaps. A financial thread that goes cold after 2 transactions. 18 months ago, that is exactly what the Unit 4000 file looked like. The work does not end, it resets. And the question that sits at the center of every reset, how long do you watch before you move, and what does watching cost, does not get easier with experience. It gets more precise. The arithmetic gets cleaner. The arithmetic was always the problem. If this kind of documented, undecorated intelligence history holds your attention, subscribe to Hidden Ops. New operations, every week, reported without decoration and without conclusion. Longer certain it had.